In this video, we're going to edit this image to have a vintage vibe in this step-by-step editing guide. Hi, I'm Rachel Koenig, professional food photographer, helping you take incredible photos that look good enough to eat. The edits we're going to focus on for this video is creating warmth through some of our color edits. We want to make sure we have enough punch through contrast, but we want to make sure our clarity is still soft and lends well to some of the details we have, like the glassware, the ice, and the sugar rim. We don't want those to feel too heavy. So going to jump into Capture One to edit this. There are very similar tools in Lightroom if you want to follow along as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is just jump in and do a little bit of white balance and color correction, because if the colors aren't right, then it just throws me. So I'm going to play around with my sliders a little bit. I feel like it could be a little bit more magenta, a little cooler. And then what I love to do is jump into the color editor, which is your color mixer in Lightroom. And we don't have a lot of blue tones and hues, so I'm just going to desaturate those, desaturate the purple slightly, as well as the greens. So now we have a good base, we can jump into our exposure and contrast adjustments. So I usually like to set my levels in Capture One, and then when it comes to a curve, I'm going to pop on a Luma curve. I feel like the Luma curve feels like more vintage because it doesn't saturate the colors in the same way, but it is a bit of a heavy adjustment sometimes. So I'm going to go ahead and just decrease some of these points. Jumping into clarity, we have a number of options that we can choose from. Because we're going for that soft feeling, I'm going to choose classic, and let's just zoom in here. We want to add a little bit of clarity. Now I really want to bring out the texture in the ice. So I'm going to use the structure slider over clarity to add a little bit more of that. Now this is the texture slider in Lightroom. And let's just have a look, see how we've got a lot of texture happening here. It's just such a beautiful slider, but I do want to make it soft so we don't have to go too far with that slider. Next up, I'm going to jump into our exposure tools. I love the brightness slider. You'll hear me say that all the time in Capture One. We want to also preserve the shadows because in an image like this where we have light tones, we have glassware, we really want to make sure that we still have dimension. So I'm going to bring down the shadows. And maybe bring down the highlights a little bit because we increased the brightness here. Now the brightness is targeting the midtones. So in my work, I like to have bright midtones. So I feel like this is a really solid foundation for us to jump into our masking and color adjustments. So let's just see how far we've come. So jumping into our layers over here, I want to make sure that the background is rich and deep. So I want to create a mask that's going to target the background. So I'm going to go ahead and select our background here. And I'm going to go ahead and just make this area a little bit darker. I'm going to deepen the shadows and some of our darker tones. And to counterbalance this adjustment, I'm going to go ahead and add some saturation because those adjustments made the color a little desaturated. And for this vintage inspired vibe, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that is rich. So here's our background. And I'm going to do a few more adjustments. So I like to use gradient tools. So we're going to go ahead and use that on the front section here. I'm going to go ahead and just brighten that area, bring down the shadows. And I feel like this part of the image could use a little bit more clarity. I love to use punch. So I'm going to go ahead and just add a little bit more of that. It just adds a really nice feeling of contrast. Lastly, for a vintage vibe, I think a vignette would be perfect. I personally like to use my gradients to create my own vignette because I feel like I have a little bit more control over that. So we're going to go ahead and add a radial gradient. Make sure it's really quite feathered. All right, and then we're going to go ahead and just decrease exposure a little bit. I'm going to decrease the shadows a little bit. bring up brightness a little. Let's see. Just pushes you into the middle, and I think it just works really well for the vibe that we're going for. So I might just play with opacity a little bit for these, but let's see our layers before and after. Now, every adjustment you make is going to affect everything else. So I always like to go in and think about, does anything need to be tweaked a little bit? So always looking back to where you've come from. Now we're going to jump into our color editor, and I think it's really simple. Just go ahead and saturate our orange and yellow colors here. We don't have a lot of green in this image, but if we were to, I want the green to read a little bit more yellow, so I'm just going to change the hue. Now those adjustments did make the background a little bit more saturated than I'm looking for. So let's just come and turn that down, dial it back a little. And lastly, I want to go ahead and add some color grading. So I'm going to jump into the color balance tool here. And we're going to focus on adding some warm tones to our shadows and highlights. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of orange to the shadows. So I'm going to desaturate this. I think with color grading, less is more, but you can totally do what works for you. And I'm going to add the same to the highlights, probably around the same tone. And just to counterbalance that, I'm going to jump into midtones and just add a little bit of blue for that cool feeling. And we always want to be making sure that we're fully checking where our edits are taking us. So I want to add a bit more of a cool feeling, and I'm just going to do that with our temperature slider here. The other edit I would recommend if you're looking for a vintage vibe is to think about if you want to add some grain to the image. So let's just zoom in here. Capture One has a number of grains that we can go for. Let's look for a soft grain. Now you could add a ton of grain if you really want to go for a vintage vibe. But again, as you heard me say, I think less is more. So I'm just going to add a little bit here. So this is where we ended up. And here is our raw file. So before and after. If you're interested in the composition for this photo, I have a video on the creative process for what inspired me to create this image, and I'll pop it in the description below. If you have any questions on Capture One or anything editing wise in this video, make sure to drop me a comment below. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.